is supported by a generous gift from the firm of Siben and Siben in Bayshore, New York. And we were hoping, but I don't see Andrew Siben here today, but we were hoping he will come and maybe he will step in later. Purpose of this professorship is to promote scholarly research, conferences, and publications in the field of family law, and it has certainly done that. And we continue to thank Siben and Siben for the wonderful gift which year after year has brought thoughtful and provocative speakers and cutting-edge scholarship to this law school. And this year's presentation by Angela Anwaki-Willig will be no different, as you shall learn shortly. That was your promise. While this series has been supported by the Siben gifts, until recently, and I thought he would be here today, its impresario has been my beloved longtime friend and colleague, the unique, now bearded, I won't let nobody alone in name, now bearded John DeWitt Gregory, who was thinking of joining us today. He was here yesterday, but he could not make it. For those of you who don't know, there's multiple pictures of him hanging in the building without a beard. The current holder of the Sidney and Walter Siben Distinguished Professorship is Joanna Grossman, a force certainly in her own right. Professor Grossman has been both a profound and prolific contributor to family law literature. Her work has appeared in a broad array of law journals, including articles in Stanford Law Review, Georgetown Law Journal, the Yale Journal on Law and Feminism. Her terrific book, co-authored with the superb legal historian Lawrence Friedman, Inside the Castle, Law and the Family in the 20th Century America, has expanded her teaching and reputation well beyond the law school world, as have her many columns in Justica Verdict. Additionally, Professor Grossman has been a highly sought participant in many family law conferences and law schools and other places throughout the country. Recently, she has participated, if you know Joanna, participate means organized, managed, in a fascinating celebrity case in California, testing the paternity rights of sperm donors under California law. So the last chapter of Professor Grossman's book, co-authored book, Inside the Castle, is basically a caution about predicting the future of family law. There is no ending, she says, quote, that was a quote, and further quote, the book comes to an end, but the story does not. The story of life goes on into the void, so too the story of law. And that's how the book ends. That I hope will be the purpose of the Siben lecture under Professor Grossman each year and over the years, to fill in that void and to tell us that story. So it's great pleasure I introduce you to Professor Joanna Grossman, the Sidney and Walter Siben Distinguished Professor of Law.
Thank you, Dean Lane. Thank you to all of you for being here. We have lots of constituencies represented, but I did want to note one special group, which is I'm teaching an undergrad family law class, and many of them are here. And it's raise your hands. You can see what people used to look like. So it's very nice to have them here, as well as people in the law school community. And of course, we end the book that way, like a movie, to set up the sequel. So that suggests that there's another thing coming, and that's Outside the Castle, coming soon. So I want to welcome you to the Siben and Siben lecture. I'm very grateful to the Siben family, which has supported the professorship and the lectureship over the years. And every fall, when I do a half marathon by their law firm that runs by, I wave and say thank you. And everybody else doesn't know what I'm talking about, but that's what I'm doing. So the lecture today will be given by Professor Angela Anwaki-Willig, who's the Charles M. and Marion J. Kirsch Professor of Law at the University of Iowa School of Law. She received her bachelor's degree at Grinnell College, which is a school I might note, and those of you in family law might remember, has a disproportionate number of couples that end up in the family law casebook. And I'm not sure why, but that might be something for us to explore together. But after Grinnell, she received her law degree at the University of Michigan. She's held many, many different positions in the public and private sector, dealing with both litigation and policy work, and I'm not going to go through all of them because I want to leave time for her to talk. But her, now as an academic, her research and teaching interests span a number of different areas, but including family and critical race theory, and it's those issues together that animate her recent and acclaimed book, According to Our Hearts, Rhinelander versus Rhinelander, The Law of the Multiracial Family. It is $39 on Amazon, and as when I checked just a minute ago, there were only 6 left, so quicker you get there, the more likely you are to get one. And I don't want to give away too much about the book, because she's going to talk about her work in the book, but I will say it involves a fascinating case at the intersection of family and race law. And I was familiar with the case before I read her book. Many years ago, there was another book written about the case based solely on newspaper articles. They never had the transcript or had any of the materials. And at the time, I wrote a review of the book. And I said, there's a great story here, but these aren't the right people to tell it. And so I was very happy when 10 or 11 years later, the right person to tell the story did tell the story. I had no idea for most of those 10 years that that's what she was doing with her time. But so she finally gave this case its due and really tied it to so many things that have been going on for generations, arising out of interracial intimacy and other family law and race issues. So she is somebody I've always admired and followed, and one of the privileges of being a distinguished professor is you get to invite people you like to come and hang out with you and come share their ideas with you. So I'm very happy to have Angela here today.
Well, first I want to thank Professor Joanna Grossman, who's someone I've long admired, for giving me this invitation to give this distinguished lecture. I also want to thank the Siben family for its generosity in endowing this annual lecture. And I want to thank everyone who's played a role in my visit. I want to thank Dean Eric Lane. I want to thank Ella Fair-Burke, John DeWitt Gregory, Barbara Stark, Theo Liebman, and Akila Falami for a great conversation last night and a wonderful welcome to your community. And I especially want to thank Judith Black for all of her work in making my arrangements to come here and for making sure everything went smoothly as well. I'm quite honored to be here and to be giving this lecture. So my lecture today comes from my book project, According to Our Hearts, Rhinelander versus Rhinelander, The Law of the Multiracial Family, which was published by Yale University Press in June 2013. And in this book, I explore the social and legal meanings of a case from 1924 and 1925, Rhinelander versus Rhinelander, by examining the case's various lessons regarding how law and society work together to frame the normative ideal of family as monoracial and also heterosexual. So According to Our Hearts consists of 2 parts. The first part of my book tells the story of Alice and Leonard Rhinelander and their trial. And the second part of my book uses the Rhinelander case as a springboard for examining 2 means by which law and society define this familial ideal. So 1, by failing to acknowledge the existence of interracial couples and thereby rendering them invisible in law and life, or interracial families. And 2, by punishing racial transgressors, those who are in interracial marriages or who break the norms of monoraciality through transracial adoption or the merging of black and white single-race families through remarriage. In examining the insights the Rhinelander case provides into law's past and continuing role in defining the familial ideal as monoracial, I focus my attention on black-white couples, those couples that racially identify in the same way that Alice and Leonard Rhinelander were ultimately viewed by the jury and the public. Also, because black-white couples are the interracial couples that severely lag behind others in the United States in terms of their actual raw numbers and percentages. But first, I want to talk to you a little bit about the Rhinelanders. So who were Alice Beatrice Jones Rhinelander and Leonard Kip Rhinelander? Well, they were really the stars of a real-life dramatic love story, one that played itself out not just in the newspapers of New York, but across the entire country. For over a year, and particularly during the month-long trial of 1925, Alice and Leonard Rhinelander captured the full attention of the American public. Alice Beatrice Jones was a working-class woman who, in the fall of 1921, met Leonard Kip Rhinelander, a wealthy white man who was a descendant of the Huguenots. Leonard and Alice quickly fell in love, And their romance blossomed over a 3-year period, including a 1.5 year period in which his family tried to separate them. The couple remained together, however, and eventually they got married by the New Rochelle mayor, Harry Scott. But unlike most weddings involving a member of New York high society, there was no wedding announcement. There was no celebration. Instead, Alice and Leonard worked to keep their marriage a secret. They didn't buy a big, luxurious house, the kind of house that a Rhinelander could certainly afford. Instead, they stayed in the very modest home of Alice's parents, British immigrants George Jones, a colored man, and I'll use that language because it was used in the materials, who worked as a taxi driver, and Elizabeth Jones, his white wife. But despite the Rhinelanders' best efforts at trying to hide their marriage, their secret was exposed. On November 13, 1924, the Standard Star of New Rochelle ran a story with the title, "Rhinelander Son Marries Daughter of a Colored Man." And thereafter, reporters swarmed the house of the Joneses and the Rhinelander newlyweds in an attempt to uncover the mystery of Alice's race and the cross-class marriage of a member of one of New York's most elite families. 2 weeks later, Leonard filed for an annulment of their marriage. He argued that Alice had lied to him about her race. According to Leonard, Alice committed fraud by telling him that she was white and failing to inform him that she was of colored blood. According to legend, Leonard and Alice were actually madly in love, and the story is that Leonard filed the lawsuit only because his father, Philip Rhinelander, forced him to do so. And the story is that Leonard actually told Alice, "Fight the case. I want you to fight the case to ensure that we can be together as husband and wife." But in 1920s New York, what did that mean socially? New York did not actually have a law that banned interracial marriages, but socially, Alice and Leonard could not be together unless she was also white. So naturally, everyone expected Alice to litigate her whiteness. In fact, early on in the case, she made certain comments that suggested that she would begin to litigate her whiteness. She would begin to try to prove that she was white. And I'll show you, this is always one of the first questions. People want to know what Alice looked like. Here are a couple pictures of Alice. And here's a picture of Alice at trial standing with her mother. But Alice actually surprises everyone when she does not attempt to prove her whiteness. Instead, she admits that she was of colored descent, and she argued that Leonard was aware of her race before the marriage. Now, this strategy meant certain death for the Rhinelanders as a couple. If Leonard won, the Rhinelander marriage would forever be erased from the books, as though it had never occurred. And if Alice won, which at the time really seemed impossible given the differences between their racial and class statures, Alice could never live with Leonard again as his wife, because a poor and colored Alice could never be the wife of the wealthy, prominent, and most important white Leonard Rhinelander. The trial of the Rhinelanders proved to be shocking on many fronts. It had racy love letters and tales of premarital lust and sex. Again, this is the 1920s. It included the testimony of Al Jolson, a blackface performer, and Irving Berlin. And it also included the exhibition of Alice's breasts, her legs, and her arms to the jury to prove that Leonard, who had seen her naked before the marriage, would have known that she was colored at the time of their marriage. Right? So this is not an actual picture, right? Because they wouldn't let the press in, obviously, when she had to expose herself. But the New York Evening Graphic ran what they called sort of a mock picture of it. They had an artist come in, they had a chorus girl pose for it, and he drew this picture. This was published to give us a scene. And what we know is that in the trial transcript, they talk about Alice and how she's weeping. She's barely able to stand, and she's having to show her body to the jurors. And then here's Alice with her family right before the trial verdict comes in. And what I always find is really interesting, you remember the first pictures that I showed? You see she's a little darker in the trial pictures. And so I've always wondered, I have no evidence of it, if that was a strategy of theirs. Although the trial takes place in November, so it would be difficult. But what was even more scandalous than her posing nude, however, was the trial's end. The jury returned a verdict for Alice, determining both that she was colored and that Leonard knew, or at least he should have known, of her racial background before marriage. A few years thereafter, the Rhinelander marriage ends as it had to socially by divorce in Las Vegas, the only remaining legal means for their separation after her victory at trial on appeal. Life, however, proved to be sad for the Rhinelanders on many fronts. Upon divorce, Leonard becomes a recluse, separated not just from the public, but also his family for the next 6 years. He never recaptured the life he had before Alice, and certainly not the type of life he had with Alice. He died at the young age of 34 in February of 1936, without ever falling in love again, and without remarrying. Right? And so this is a picture of Leonard working at one of his homes in Nevada. Alice, on the other hand, lived until her late 80s, but to use the word live may be an exaggeration. She survived on what was a substantial, at that time, settlement of $31,000 and about $3,500 every year that she won in the case. And though she was surrounded by her family members for the rest of her life, she never partnered with another man. In 1989, when Alice passed away, she left us with one last reminder of how she may have really died more than 60 years earlier in 1925, at the end of her infamous trial. She buried herself with a headstone that read, Alice J. Rhinelander. And so we get this idea many, many years later that she's been pining for her lost love for the rest of her life. So for me, the Rhinelander story represents so many different kinds of stories. On the one hand, it's a sad love story, the story of two lovers who were torn apart by prejudice, racism, and classism. On the other hand, it's a racial victory. No one really expected Alice would win, and yet she won. In fact, one of the Rhinelander jurors really summed up how this trial could be viewed as a racial victory when he said, if we had voted according to our hearts, the title of my book, the verdict might have been different. So if they had voted according to their hearts, Alice would have lost. Although occurring almost a century ago, the lives of Alice and Leonard Rhinelander remain relevant in today's society. In addition to teaching us about the various struggles that can occur in defining one's own racial identity, especially for multiracial individuals like Alice, and many believe that Alice actually viewed herself as white, the Rhinelander narrative forecasts a strong lingering taboo against interracial marriage in general and black-white marriage in particular. More so, the story of the Rhinelanders provides us with many important lessons about how law and society have often functioned together to frame the normative ideal of family as monoracial, both in our history and in our present. And in this lecture, I want to provide some background information for understanding law and society's joint role in framing this ideal family. I do so first by exploring what I call the black and white or ranking of love, not just along racial lines, but also across constructions of gender. And in so doing, although I address how the normative ideal family is also defined as being rooted in heterosexuality, and I do so even more in the book, I generally focus my analyses on black-white heterosexual couples. I radically acknowledge the widespread exclusion of gay and lesbian couples and their children from normative definitions of family. But what I wanted to do with this book was I wanted to ask the kinds of questions that don't get posed about interracial and multiracial families. I wanted to unpack widely held assumptions about how law adequately protects people who are part of interracial families in a post-Loving versus Virginia era. And so here I'll just set the stage for a larger discussion. And in so doing, I'll first briefly detail historical and contemporary perceptions about black-white marriages. And I want to compare those perspectives to contemporary views concerning other types of interracial marriages. Thereafter, I'll analyze how perceptions about black-white marriage can become even more complicated when one examines gender dimensions of black-white intimacy. And the most prominent historical image of interracial intimacy in the United States is Mildred and Richard Loving, right? So they're the black female, white male married couple who fought for and won national legal recognition for all interracial marriages in a case aptly called Loving versus Virginia, which struck down anti-miscegenation statutes held that they violated both the Equal Protection Clause and the Due Process Clause. However, the racial and gender makeup of the Lovings is rarely reflected among today's interracial couples. In fact, black women and white men are among the least likely individuals to marry each other in the United States. Excuse me. In fact, gender dimensions of interracial intimacy become even more startling when one considers the past treatment of relationships and marriages between black men and white women, relationships that have historically been viewed as more threatening and as more deserving of harsh punishments than other types of interracial reunions, those of black women and white men. So if the White Leonard trial teaches us anything, it is that black-white love is the greatest taboo of all interracial intimacies, that black-white marriages are the least normative of all heterosexual relationships. Alice's once dear friend, Miriam Rich, declared as much during her trial testimony against Alice. According to Miriam Rich, after the story of Alice's race and marriage to Leonard became public, a distraught Alice promised to prove that she was white, proclaiming that Leonard, quote, would rather have married an Indian than he'd married a negress, end quote. In other words, marrying black was among the worst things that Leonard could do. And when we look at the mere count of statutes in the United States that have banned black-white marriages as compared to other types of interracial marriages, we can confirm as much. The number of state statutes that prohibited marriages between blacks and whites far exceeded those that prohibited marriage between whites and any other type of racial or ethnic minorities. Of the 38 states that at one time or another banned interracial marriages, all of them prohibited black-white marriage, but less than one half, only 14 of them prohibited Asian-white marriage, and less than 1/6, just 7 of them prohibited Native American white marriage. None of them prohibited Latino or Hispanic white marriage, which is much more complicated because it's an ethnicity versus a race. Given this history of black-white relationships as compared to other interracial relationships, it should come as no surprise that blacks remain uniquely isolated in terms of interracial marriage, with whites when compared to other racial and ethnic minority groups. Recent statistics show that 93% of blacks have same-race marriage partners, only 70% of Asian Americans and Latinos, and less than 33% of American Indians have same-race marital partners. With the exception of whites, blacks are the least likely of any racial or ethnic group to marry across racial lines. So these facts are critical, not because whites are a superior group with whom blacks should want to mix, but rather because, well, what Professor Randall Kennedy explained. And Professor Kennedy said, quote, interracial marriage signals that outsiders, here blacks, are gaining acceptance in the eyes of the dominant population and are perceived by them as persons of value on whom it is worth risking one's future. Because interracial marriage breaks down the psychological barriers that separate and distance people on racial grounds. And because intermarriage encourages the inculcation of transracial empathy that is crucial for enabling people to place themselves in the shoes of others racially different from themselves. So as he basically argues, there are few situations that are more likely to mobilize a racially privileged individual to move against racial wrongs than witnessing such wrongs inflicted upon one's mother-in-law or father-in-law or spouse or child. And within the already comparatively low rates of outmarriage for blacks, another significant disparity exists, the disparity between the outmarriage rates of black men and black women. Professor Ralph Richard Blanks has highlighted in his book, Is Marriage for Black People, that black women are far less likely than black men to marry across racial lines. In 2000, 9.7% of black men were married to whites, while only 4.1% of black women were. And out of new marriages in 2008, 22% of all black male newlyweds outmarried as compared to just 9% of all black females. So overall, black men outmarried 2.4 times more than black women. So even today, in modern day Alices, meaning black or biracial black, white, or black other women, and modern day Leonards, meaning white men, are unlikely to become intimate partners and more so marital partners. And if we were going to look at current dating statistics to determine what the outlook of black-female outmarriage may be in the future, that picture would also signal that there won't be much of an increase. Despite white daters' express openness to cross-racial intimacy, their actual behaviors indicate that black, female, white, male color and gender line is often too much for people to cross. So in a study in 2009, researchers from the University of California published the results of a study of online daters, or people who were using the internet to find mates. And they looked at people who were willing to articulate their racial preferences in their profiles. And among that group of whites, those who were willing to express their racial preferences, black women ranked the lowest among women of all races and ethnicities as desirable partners. So overall, the researchers found that white men express a racial preference for dating only white women much less frequently than white women express a preference for dating only white men. So that was surprising for me in itself. With only 29% of white men indicating a whites-only preference and 64% of white women indicating a whites-only preference. The researchers also found that white men who articulated racial preferences included a greater number of people from different racial groups at an average of 3.42 than white women who indicated racial preferences, who included on average 1.84 different racial and ethnic groups. But in particular, the researchers found that while over 90% of white women who articulated their racial preference desired not to date men from 4 groups, East Indians, Middle Easterners, Asians, and blacks, 90% or above of white men who stated a racial preference excluded only one group of women from their dating preferences, black women. Also, in 2009, the dating website OkCupid released statistics about its customers' preferences that revealed blacks, in particular black women, to be the least desirable partners. They were looking at first contact attempts and response rates. And they assumed that they would basically match the percentage of reply rates of their customers. And instead they found that while black heterosexual women were actually the most likely of any group of heterosexuals to reply when contacted at 1.5 times the average response rate, they received the far fewest replies. So basically, black women were the friendliest and they're most willing to respond to others, but they received the fewest replies. As the website explained, quote, men don't write black women back, or rather they write them back far less often than they should. Black women reply the most, they get by far the fewest replies. Essentially, every race, including other blacks, singles them out for the cold shoulder. In addition to looking at how race affected the first attempt and response rates for heterosexual customers, OkCupid also analyzed the same data from gay and lesbian customers. OkCupid announced that similar race-based prejudices showed up among its gay and lesbian clients. So overall, again, blacks received the fewest response. Instead here, gay black men fared the worst, receiving 20% fewer responses from non-blacks, and black lesbians remained the female group that other lesbians replied to the least, although that discrepancy was much smaller. Several years ago, how many of you guys are probably too young to know about John? You know John Mayer? Yeah. Okay. Because I never know. He hasn't released a song in a while, so I didn't know. So John Mayer really highlighted the marginality of black female, white male relationships during an interview with Playboy several years ago. So he came under fire for honestly revealing his aversion to dating black women. In response to a question about whether black women throw themselves at him in the same way that white women do, Mayer, who ironically sings a black form of music called the blues, made this statement. I don't think I opened myself up to it. My dick is sort of like a white supremacist. I've got a Benetton heart and a effing David Duke cock. I'm going to start dating separately from my dick. And then when he was asked to be more particular about dating separately from his dick, he replied, well, I always thought Holly Robinson Peete was gorgeous. She was from 21 Jump Street. You guys know her? Okay. Every white dude loved Hillary from the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. And Kerry Washington, she's super hot. And she's also white girl crazy. Kerry Washington would break your heart like a white girl. Just all of a sudden she'd be like, yeah, I sucked his dick, whatever. And you'd be like, what? We weren't talking about that. And that's what heartbreak warfare is all about. And a girl uses jealousy as a tactic. So Mayer caught a lot of flack for his comments, and rightfully so. But he, just like Miriam Rich during the writing of the trial, also revealed several key points, insights that are critical to understanding the centrality of race in framing the normative ideal family and intimacy, as well as the particularly low status of black, female, white, male relationships within the hierarchy of these families. So first, he exposed the way in which interracial relationships have often been viewed as purely sexual and physical, the result of animal attraction, or as one movie put it, jungle fever. In talking about his decision not to date black women, Mayer equated interracial sex with interracial love. He explained that in order to stop being like David Duke, he had to start dating separately from his dick, which he noted functioned separately from his Benetton heart, the very organ that our society widely regards as governing true intimacy. So with his crass words, Mayer demonstrated the way in which black-white relationships are often cast as being about sexual gratification or forbidden fruit, rather than by what we commonly view as real love. So for example, consider this description by Camille Nelson, a black woman who is a current dean of Suffolk Law School and also a former Hofstra law professor. She discussed how strangers have completely sexualized her relationship with her white husband. In one instance, she described an occasion in which a man next to them in the bar could only make sense of their relationship by thinking of them as porn stars. She wrote, enjoying digestives in the piano lounge, the query of the man sitting next to us at the bar shocked us. Are you two porn stars? He asked. I nearly fell off the bar stool. After regaining my composure, I explained to him that we were vacationing in celebration of our 10th wedding anniversary, that we had 3 children, that I was a law professor, and that my husband worked in film, but not in that way. I honestly cannot remember exactly what my husband said, but he did mention slightly that we would have a lot more money if we were porn stars and wouldn't be driving a minivan and a Cavalier. I doubt we were very coherent. We were shocked and had no time to summon the full force of our annoyance. There in the lounge, an external assessor and his lascivious questioning eclipsed our romantic musings. Our critical consciousness demanded that we both simultaneously claim the normal. We both used the tried and true strategy used by many interracial couples. We constructed our lives like everyone else's in order to highlight the banality of it all. No, we are not porn stars. We wanted in that moment to blend in and to not be seen. Nothing unusual here. No racialized spectacle to be observed. Just plain ordinary and racially average. Alice and Leonard Rhinelander, too, found themselves defined in textual terms by others, particularly by Isaac Mills, Leonard's attorney. Mills repeatedly intimated throughout the trial that the only way that Alice and Leonard's relationship could make sense was through sex. In the eyes of Mills, nothing else could make a Rhinelander, Leonard Rhinelander, fall so deeply for the working class colored girl. As Mills argued, Alice's hold over Leonard was simply the work of sexually experienced colored women, women he claimed were mature beyond their years, over a boy upon whom no woman had ever smiled before. Mills conveyed his message about the sexual nature of interracial intimacy to the jurors in a variety of ways at trial, but particularly through numerous oral readings of Alice's letters to Leonard, many of which reference sex and sexual activity between the two lovers. So overall, the desire to define interracial intimacy as linked to sexual gratification alone, rather than to love, stems in part from white supremacy, the notion, whether consciously or non-consciously, held that whites are superior to blacks. The idea is that in an unnatural world, guided solely by physical pleasure, persons may act upon their animal instincts, giving into their jungle fever or impure desires. But in a natural world, individuals are attracted to those like them, their hearts reaching out to their true soulmates, which are naturally expected to be people of the same race. So for instance, each year during my race and family section of my critical race theory course, students, particularly white students, explain the widespread monoracial constructions of families across the nation as a consequence of simple human nature. Students who just previously understood how race was socially constructed and how magazine and movie images can affect us all and shape how we see people and can shape racial stereotypes, declare, well, quote, you can't help nature. You can't help who you're attracted to. In their eyes, because they believe in racial equality and are liberal, they do not view their mating choices or those of their friends as influenced at all by racial bias, even non-conscious racial bias. Instead, their choices regarding dating and marriage become marked not by unconscious or conscious cues about race and intimacy, but by constructed images of beauty and attractiveness, but rather by natural personal preferences. It's in this sense that John Mayer brings us another important lesson about race and intimacy with his Playboy interview. The lesson that our intimate relationships, and thus families in the United States, are not shaped solely by personal preference, but also by social and legal cues about the normative ideal of families. Although Mayer referenced ideas about the purely sexual nature of interracial relationships in his interview, he also challenged his own view of monoraciality in dating and mating as inevitable. Mayer here was different from whites in other studies because he, rather than defending his dating practices as natural personal preferences, he criticized them by articulating and explaining their link to what he identified as white supremacy, as David Duke in action. In this way, he separated himself from whites who explain their dating and mating choices as a simple result of natural personal preferences. Unlike those participants, as well as the internet daters in the Irvine study, Mayer openly and honestly spoke about his preferences as racist, asserting his desire to change them, and most importantly, his willingness to challenge them as long and closed off. So overall, one must wonder to what extent, if we go back to Alice and Leonard, to what extent A significant segment of our nation's citizens today view knowledge of racial background, in particular blackness, the factor that goes to the essence of marriage, as a factor that could warrant an annulment. In other words, could a litigant today successfully identify racial fraud as a factor that goes to the essence of marriage in an annulment case? Courts have held with concealment of matters such as temper, idleness, extravagance, boldness, and fortune cannot serve as the basis for an annulment. They've also held that misrepresentation about financial means or social position does not go to the essence of marriage. So instead, they say that misrepresentation must be so material and important that it essentially destroys the marital agreement, and that differs from state to state. But what would the answer to this dilemma be regarding representations of racial background, even after Loving versus Virginia? The fact that Loving forever changed family law, and thus families, by striking down anti-miscegenation statutes, does not in itself resolve this legal question about race and annulment. After all, even in Rhinelander, where New York did not ban interracial marriages between blacks and whites, knowledge of a spouse's race was without question viewed as satisfying the lower standard of being material to decisions about marriage. The short answer to my question is that today, knowledge of a spouse's race is unlikely to be a legally sufficient basis for an annulment. But the longer answer reveals a much more complex response that may lean toward yes, and I'll explain why. So looking first at the short answer of no, courts are unlikely to find race to be a sufficient basis for an annulment, because annulments do not serve the same purpose as Joanna, as Professor Grossman has actually explained, as they did during the 1920s. People can get divorces much more easily, and so that makes the idea of giving someone an annulment much less likely in general. Moreover, it would be difficult to grant an annulment based on what could be viewed solely as racial prejudice in light of cases like Palmer versus Sidney, where the Supreme Court held that racial prejudice cannot serve as the determinative basis for making child custody decisions between parents. But while granting an annulment based on racial fraud in a post-Loving world does not seem likely, it's hard to imagine, given the current state of race relations, that some judges would not be sympathetic to this argument. In this sense, we may not be so different from the time when Alice and Leonard were in battles over their annulment. In fact, our entire practice of regulating intimate relationships reveals that our society fervently protects people's preferences to discriminate on the basis of race in terms of the people whom they form intimate relationships. As Professor Rachel Moran has highlighted, when 95% of all marriages in America take place between people of the same race, race shapes marital choice. But just as importantly, marriage shapes racial identity. The freedom to select our intimates is also the power to define racial difference. And because we view private relationship choices in non-discriminatory nature, rarely do we pose the question of why 93% of all marriages are same-race, or consider whether such statistics are the result of racial bias, whether conscious or non-conscious. So for instance, consider that OkCupid uncovered what OkCupid uncovered about its customers' views towards interracial dating and marriage. As part of its survey, it posed two questions to their customers. One, is interracial marriage a bad idea? And two, would you strongly prefer to date someone of your own skin, color, or racial background? And OkCupid discovered that customers largely did not view interracial marriage as a bad idea, with yes responses ranging from 2% to 7%, and with whites having the highest yes rate at 7%. But although the customers did not see interracial marriage as a bad idea, more significant percentage of them strongly preferred to date someone of their own race. Minority preferences for same-race dating range from 11% to 33%, with black men at 11% and Native American women at 33%. And both white male and female preferences for same-race dating, however, far exceeded both the highest same-race preference rate and average same-race preference rate for minorities, with white men at 40% and white women at a whopping 54%. On average, only 20% of non-whites prefer to date someone of the same race compared to 45% of whites. And the responses of gay and lesbian customers indicated similar disparities. So first, most people did not view interracial marriage as a bad idea, with yes responses to that question ranging from 0 to 4%. However, when asked about same-race dating preferences, whether someone would strongly prefer to date someone of their same race, again, we saw similar racial disparities. Minority, gay, lesbian, and bisexual preferences for same-race dating range from 6% to 21%, with black gay men at 6% and Middle Eastern gay men at 21%. White, gay, lesbian, and bisexual preferences for same-race dating exceeded both the highest same-rate preference rate and the average same-race preference rate, with white gay men at 43%, white bisexual men at 27%, white lesbians at 31%, and white bisexual women at 31%. On average, only 15% of non-white gays and lesbians and bisexuals prefer to date someone of the same race, compared to 35% of whites. And the law continues to facilitate the use of race as a determinative factor in the construction of families. In fact, courts have recognized a legal loss to persons whose ability to construct families based on monoracial preferences has been marred by third-party interference. So in New York, a judge recognized a similar claim by a cultural Dominican and white couple who sued a clinic that used sperm from a black donor to conceive their daughter during in vitro fertilization. The New York couple proclaimed their love for their child, but mourned the daily and visual reminder of the mistake that had been made. Reportedly, the mistake came to their attention because of the unusually dark color of their newborn as compared to her brown, or at least in U.S. terms, black-looking mother and white father. The couple was reported as saying, the baby's race is simply impossible to ignore, revealing that in some instances the monoracial ideal for families extends beyond race and all the way even to color. More recently, a lawsuit brought by Jennifer Cramblett, a white lesbian from Ohio, reveals how the monoracial family norm persists in our society. And if successful, her lawsuit will reveal just one of many ways in which law and social norms continue to work together to frame the normative ideal of family as monoracial. Cramblett is suing Midwest Sperm Bank, alleging that the company mistakenly gave her vials from an African-American donor, a fact that she said has made it difficult for her and her same-sex partner, Amanda Zircon, to raise their biracial black-white toddler daughter, Peyton, in an all-white community. She's suing them for breach of warranty, wrongful birth. She's citing economic and emotional losses that she's suffered. And her complaint, in fact, includes comments that assume that no one would purposely seek a multiracial family. So, for example, it asserts, when the receptionist returned for the second time, she asked Jennifer if she had requested an African-American donor, to which she replied, "No, why would I request that? My partner and I are Caucasian. You know that from our profiles," end quote. And although Cramblett indicates that she is bonded with her daughter and that she and Zircon love their daughter, Peyton, she asserts that she lives each day with fears, anxieties, and uncertainty about her future and Peyton's future. She further asserts that raising a mixed-race daughter has been stressful in her small all-white town, where people have stereotypical attitudes about non-whites. She's stressed because her family, which has already had a difficult time accepting her homosexuality, has always advised her not to look different. And precisely because of the strong norm and expectation of monoraciality in families, Cramblett's family will look even more different. Moreover, as Lorenzo Maldonado has explained, although the law no longer allows race to be used as a reason to deny or delay placement of a child for domestic adoption or foster care, it participates in discrimination by facilitating the decisions of many white adoptive families who may be choosing to adopt European and Asian children from abroad instead of black and brown children in the United States, based upon either conscious or unconscious preferences. In sum, the ways in which we protect potential race discrimination along the lines of intimacy and have used law as a tool to regulate race and adoption in the family hint at the continuing prominence of race as an essential of marriage, or more broadly speaking, of family today, even if courts would not explicitly recognize it as essential in a normal case. And in a society that views children as central to marriage, it's difficult to imagine that courts would not sympathize with arguments concerning whether a suing partner willingly chose to have a racially mixed child. In fact, we know of at least one former judge who has expressed sentiments about interracial couples precisely because of concerns about biracial children. In 2009, Judge Keith Bardwell refused to marry an interracial couple, a black-white interracial couple, because he feared for their mixed-race children. He argued that biracial children would not be accepted by either whites or blacks. He further asserted, quote, "I don't do interracial marriages because I don't want to put children in a situation they don't bring on themselves. In my heart, I feel children will later suffer." And in an effort to explain his actions more, he stated that in his experiences, interracial marriages do not last long. Unless we think that Bardwell was just one rogue judge who ignored the law, Consider the fact that many of his colleagues knew what he was doing in refusing to marry interracial couples, and not only never reported him, but in fact accepted his referrals of interracial couples to marry. It may have been that his colleagues saw his views about interracial couples in the way that so many individuals view questions of intimacy among lovers and families, to be mere personal and natural preference, not racism. In fact, Barbell himself explained his beliefs in this way, quoting, "I'm not a racist. I just don't believe in mixing the races that way. I have piles and piles of black friends. They come to my home, I marry them, they use my bathroom, I treat them just like, not interracially, and I treat them just like everyone else." But it is exactly this failure to examine our perception of these intimate matters as private decisions that deserve both social and legal protection that works to perpetuate the framing of the monoracial family as normative ideal. Luckily, Bardwell, through his actions and words, made it easier for many people to see the connections between these private decisions and the social and legal cues and norms that work to perpetuate racial hierarchies. Bardwell made us ask ourselves, who comes to our homes? Whom do we marry or see as marriageable? Or even shamefully, whom do we allow to use our bathrooms? Do we and our families all receive the same social, legal, and legal privileges, regardless of race or multiple monoraciality? And finally, are we willing to walk away from the things that we've internalized as being according to our hearts, somewhat like the jury did in Rhinelander, so that we can embrace those things that we actually desire to be a part of our hearts? Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions. I just want to thank Angela for giving truth to what John Gregory always used to say when he was the Siben professor at the Siben lecture, that his family law is the most dynamic area of the law school curriculum. Right. Thank you for sharing that. So we can take a few questions. Kirby?
Yeah, thank you for a fascinating lecture. I just wanted to ask you about the quirk of the racial construction. Alice and that couple was seen as multiracial, but President Obama's marriage is generally seen as same-racial, even though that's a trick of history. I just wondered if you could comment on why the fact that he is biracial and she is biracial, and yet the characterization seems to be stuck in history.
Yeah, so I think that's in part because of the one-drop rule, right? So the one-drop rule is that if you have one drop of black blood, you're viewed as being black, or one drop of any non-white blood, you're viewed as being part of the what's considered to be the inferior race, right? And so I think the way it works, the reason why it works that way, right, is precisely because when you have because of this one-drop rule and all the rationale behind it about inferiority and superiority, inherent superiority and inferiority of different races. That when you have a multiracial person who's marrying a white person, that's viewed as interracial. And when you have a multiracial person that's marrying a monoracial person of color, that's not viewed as being interracial because that one drop has made them all of whatever the minority race is. And I think it's really white supremacy at work, right? It's how we view whites as being superior and all other groups as being inherently inferior. Whether it's conscious or not, but I think people have internalized that, so that's what that is.
You talk about the fact that African American men are more likely than African American women to marry out of their race. I was wondering, through your research, is that personal choice or is that more of a social construct?
Yeah, so I think that Rick Banks' book suggests that it's a little bit of both, right? But I would say that it's primarily social construct. So part of it is tied into the way images of black women. There's a lot of research that talks about images of black women are generally constructed out of sort of the beauty norms or the beauty ideals, right? The things that we tend to highlight as being normative beauty. But then also the images of black women as being, or more, this is played into how people, the research shows, images of black women as being more masculine has also had some effect on what is deemed the attractiveness or non-attractiveness of black women. Now, some of it is people say that there's partial choice because black women have been more resistant to out marriage or interracial dating than other groups, and even polling data would suggest that. I think that's changing. But I think that also too is a social construction in the same way that white women are also more resistant to interracial dating than white men. I think that's the sort of pressures that are placed on women who are viewed as the carriers of race, right? So even if you look historically, for example, the regulation of the intimacy choices of white women were punished. You could lose your freedom if you dated a black person during slavery. There were statutes that determined that the race of the child, if the mother was white, that had consequences for the children. Black men and white women were punished more harshly in terms of jail sentences. Of course, black men were lynched a lot for those relationships. So women in general have been regulated. If you look at the desegregation movement, that was all about really the focus of keeping black men away from white women. And then I think you see on the same side that black women face those same pressures, right? Women are generally seen as the carriers of race, as the people who raise children. It's all about the production of either whiteness or blackness. And so I think that I would say that it's all a construction, that there's this gender and race dynamic working here along with the soul race dynamic.
Hi, I think you touched on it in your answer just now to the student, but I wonder, you mentioned Kerry Washington, and I don't know if you got Scandal, but I wonder.
I don't want Scandal, but I know about it.
So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on the intraracial, if you will, response by black men to the show, to Kerry Washington, Olivia Pope, or the president, if you will, being in love with Olivia Pope. There are all these minds on Facebook that it's impossible. You're actually, that a white man could actually love a black woman, coming from black men in some way. So, rather than sort of a white male construction, if you will, or white construction of the conversation, coming instead from an interracial black male perspective that, don't you know, black woman, that he couldn't possibly love you. It's really about the slavery trope. You're just his property, if you will. So
Right. Yeah, so I think you already explained all the problems with that. My problem with the relationship, and I don't watch the show, I hear it's really great. So, but my problem with it is why is it that even the relationship between her and the president is the relationship? Why couldn't she be the first lady? Why is it that she's the person he's having an affair with? She's the mistress, right? So the interracial marriage is not even, the ideal there, right? That she's the mistress who's cheating with the president on his white wife, right? And so, for me, I find that whole disturbing, because it's a very prominent interracial couple, but it's a deviant, what we would consider to be a deviant relationship in our society.
All right, just last question, please.
You spoke during the lecture and answering a question that there's a societal construction of protecting white women from black men. And I was wondering if you thought the cases we discussed today would have went the same way as they did, like Loving in Virginia, it was a black male,
Yes.
a white female being married,
Yes.
if society
Yes.
wouldn't have made it.
Yes. Yeah, no, I actually, well, I mean, a lot of people have talked about the various cases that came before that led for building black. I think that had to be, part because the Lovings were willing to do it, but I think that was also a strategic choice. That I think that there would have been much more non-conscious resistance, I think, to ruling to go that way in Loving, Virginia, if it was a black man versus a white woman. Yeah, absolutely. And I think you still see the same resistance to it, and just generally in our society. There's this movie, I don't know, what's the new Will Smith movie? I haven't seen it yet. Focus. A lot of people, it hasn't done very well, has it? And it's, there were a couple of years ago when he did
Here's the
Hitch.
mic.
Oh.
Okay, we're not hearing you.
Sorry. When Will Smith did a movie called Hitch with Eva Mendes, and there was a lot of he spoke up about it because I guess when they were thinking about who were going to be the women who were going to be cast opposite him. They said that we can't do a white woman, right, because it won't sell. And so he spoke up about it. He kind of thought that was problematic, and they chose Eva Mendes, which I kind of think was the negotiation. She's Latina. She's actually Afro-Latina. I didn't know, but I later learned. And the one thing about Loving is the statute in Virginia banned all marriages between whites and non-whites, but allowed non-whites to marry within each other, right? So you even see with the decision of Hitch that playing itself out in the same way. And then Focus, which is, I think his love interest in this movie now is a white woman. And I think even that, I mean, there've been some rumblings about resistance to people seeing the movie, in part because of the interracial relationship. So maybe the movie directors were right about it. And I don't think it's done very well. And Will Smith is usually a blockbuster kind of film star. I haven't seen it yet. Has anyone seen it? Yeah. So what? So at least one person's seen it. And maybe it's just a bad movie. I don't know.
I like every movie.
But I think absolutely.
All right, so let's call it there. Thank you very much for being here.